Today, when people think about the Holy Land, they think about the Bible. Abraham and Isaac, Moses and the Exodus, David and Solomon. These are the stories that shaped Western civilization, the narratives we've heard 1,000 times. But here's what almost nobody knows. Before any of these biblical figures walked the earth, before the first word of Scripture was ever written, there was another civilization living in this land. A sophisticated, powerful, culturally rich society that built cities, traded across continents, and worshipped gods whose names would later become synonyms for evil. They were called the Canaanites. And the Bible wanted you to forget they ever existed, not just forget them. The Hebrew scriptures portrayed them as the ultimate villains, practitioners of child sacrifice and sexual depravity, enemies to be conquered and utterly destroyed. God himself, according to the book of Joshua, commanded their complete annihilation. For thousands of years, that's how history remembered them, if it remembered them at all. The Canaanites became a cautionary tale, a civilization so wicked that divine genocide was justified. Except here's the problem with that story. It's not true, not even close. In the past few decades, archaeologists have been digging up something extraordinary in Israel, Lebanon, Syria and Jordan. Not just pottery shards and broken walls, but evidence of a civilization that was astonishingly advanced. They invented the alphabet that you're reading right now. They built sprawling trade networks that connected 3 continents. They created art, literature, and religious texts that influenced everyone from the ancient Greeks to the early Israelites themselves. And perhaps most shocking of all, genetic studies published in just the last few years have proven something remarkable. The Canaanites weren't destroyed. They're still here. Their DNA flows through the veins of millions of people living in Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and yes, even Israel today. So what actually happened? Who are these people that the Bible worked so hard to erase? Why were they demonized? And what can their story tell us about the real history of the Holy Land before Scripture turned it into something else entirely? If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's completely fine. That's genuinely why I make these. But maybe hit subscribe first and tell me where you are and what time it is right now. I love checking comments and seeing Tokyo at sunrise, London at lunch, Los Angeles at midnight, all watching the same story unfold. Here's what makes the Canaanite story so incredible. We're not talking about some minor tribe that vanished into obscurity. We're talking about a civilization that dominated the Eastern Mediterranean for thousands of years. When the pyramids of Egypt were already ancient, the Canaanites were building fortified cities. When Babylon was rising to power in Mesopotamia, Canaanite merchants were sailing across the Mediterranean, establishing colonies that would become legendary. The Phoenicians, those master sailors who everybody's heard of, they were Canaanites. Same people, same culture, just a different chapter of the story. But somehow this entire civilization got compressed into a few ugly chapters of the Old Testament, reduced to obstacles in someone else's story, enemies to be cleared away so the real narrative could begin. It's like trying to understand the history of North America by only reading about the Wild West and ignoring the thousands of years of indigenous civilization that came before. You'd miss everything that actually matters. What we're about to uncover changes everything. From the very first farmers who settled in Jericho 10,000 years ago, making it one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities on earth, to the Bronze Age kingdoms that traded with pharaohs and built temples that rivaled anything in the ancient world. From the gods and goddesses whose myths would echo through Greek and Roman religion, to the mysterious sea peoples whose invasion triggered a catastrophic collapse. From the real origins of the Israelites, which archaeology has revealed are far more complicated than Exodus suggests, to the genetic detective work that's rewriting the story right now. This isn't just ancient history. This is the foundation beneath the foundation. The civilization that was here first. The people whose cities became Jerusalem and Sidon and Tyre, whose language evolved into Hebrew, whose gods became demons, whose descendants never actually left. So let's go back. Way back. Before Abraham heard the call, before Moses saw the burning bush, before David faced Goliath, let's go back 10,000 years and discover who was really living in the land that would become the crossroads of civilization. The land that everyone would fight over. The land that 3 religions would call holy. Because before any of that, before the Bible began its story, there was Canaan. Forget everything you think you know about the beginning of civilization. Forget Mesopotamia. Forget Egypt. The real story starts in a narrow strip of land between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River, where something happened 12,000 years ago that would change human history forever. The last ice age was ending. For 100,000 years, glaciers had covered much of the northern hemisphere, locking up so much water that sea levels were 400 feet lower than today. You could walk from Europe to Britain, from Siberia to Alaska. The world was a very different place. But around 12,000 BCE, the climate shifted. Temperature rose, rainfall patterns changed, and in one specific region, something extraordinary happened. The eastern Mediterranean coast, the land that would eventually be called Canaan, transformed into what anthropologists now call the Fertile Crescent's western anchor. Grasslands that had been sparse and seasonal suddenly became lush and reliable. Wild cereals, barley and wheat spread across hillsides in dense harvestable stands. Gazelles, wild cattle, and other game animals multiplied in numbers that seem almost impossible today. And the humans living there noticed. These people, the culture we now call the Natufians, were hunter-gatherers. But they weren't like the mobile bands that had dominated human society for hundreds of thousands of years. They were doing something unprecedented. They were staying put. The archaeological evidence is unmistakable. Starting around 12,500 BCE, Natufian communities began building permanent villages. Not seasonal camps that got abandoned when resources moved. Actual villages with stone foundations, storage facilities, and evidence of year-round occupation. They were building homes designed to last generations, not seasons. The most remarkable site is Ain Malahar in northern Israel. Over 50 circular stone structures, some with plastered floors, arranged in clusters that suggest family units. Storage pits dug into bedrock, grinding stones so heavy they could never be transported. This wasn't a temporary camp, this was home. But here's what's truly wild. They were doing all this before agriculture existed. The Natufians weren't farming. They were harvesting wild grain so abundant that it made sense to stay in one place. They developed sickles with flint blades, tools specifically designed for cutting grain stalks. The blades show a distinctive polish, what archaeologists call sickle sheen, created by cutting silica-rich grain stems over and over. They built granaries to store their harvests. They developed elaborate grinding stones to process the grain into flour. They had essentially created all the infrastructure of agricultural civilization without actually domesticating a single plant. They were living on nature's abundance, but in a way that required permanent settlement, specialized tools, and complex planning. It was an evolutionary stepping stone, a halfway point between mobile hunting and farming that nobody had predicted could exist. And it worked. For over 3,000 years, Natufian sites show evidence of populations far larger than typical hunter-gatherer bands. Some villages might have housed 200, 300 people living together year-round. They developed art, carving animal figures and human forms from stone and bone. They created personal ornaments from shells traded from the Mediterranean coast. They buried their dead with elaborate grave goods, suggesting concepts of status and perhaps even early forms of inherited wealth. Most remarkably, they domesticated the dog. Not wolves following human camps hoping for scraps, but actual domestic dogs, bred for specific traits, living alongside humans in permanent settlements. The earliest undisputed domestic dog remains come from a Natufian site, a puppy buried carefully beside a human, their hand positioned as if resting on the dog's shoulder. Even 12,000 years later, that gesture of affection is unmistakable. But then, around 10,800 BCE, disaster struck. The climate changed again, suddenly, catastrophically. A period called the Younger Dryas plunged the region back into near Ice Age conditions for over 1,000 years. The wild grain fields that had supported permanent villages began failing. Rainfall became unreliable, the easy abundance disappeared. The Natufians faced a choice. They could go back to mobile hunting and gathering, abandoning their villages and their settled lifestyle, or they could try something desperate. They could attempt to control their food supply directly. They chose the second option, and in doing so they invented agriculture. The transition wasn't smooth or intentional. It was a messy, desperate response to environmental crisis. But by 9,500 BCE, communities across the region were deliberately planting and harvesting domesticated grains. They were selecting seeds from the most productive plants, saving them through winter, and planting them in prepared fields the following spring. The Neolithic Revolution, the transformation from hunting and gathering to farming, wasn't a discovery. It was an act of desperation by a people who refused to give up their settled lifestyle when nature stopped providing. And it happened first, or at least very early, right here in Canaan. By 9000 BCE, farming villages dotted the landscape from the Mediterranean coast to the Jordan Valley. Permanent settlements built from mud brick, harvesting domesticated wheat and barley, herding early domestic goats and sheep. These weren't just villages anymore. They were becoming something else entirely. Enter Jericho. Walk into any archaeology department and mention Jericho, and you'll see professors' eyes light up. Because Jericho isn't just ancient. It's absurdly ancient. Impossibly ancient. So ancient that it makes other ancient cities look like modern suburbs. The first settlement at Jericho dates to around 9,600 BCE. That's 11,600 years ago. For context, that's 6,000 years before the Egyptian pyramids, 7,000 years before Stonehenge, 8,500 years before the first writing appears in Mesopotamia. And it wasn't a village. By 8,000 BCE, Jericho had become something that wouldn't be matched anywhere else in the world for thousands of years. It had a stone wall, a massive stone wall over 11 feet tall and 5 feet thick running around the entire settlement. Inside the wall was a stone tower, 28 feet tall, with an internal staircase of 22 steps. Read that again. 10,000 years ago, people in Jericho were building monumental architecture in stone. Nobody knows why. The wall doesn't seem designed for defense, at least not against human enemies. It's too small to protect against a determined army. Some archaeologists think it was a flood barrier protecting the settlement from seasonal flooding. Others suggest it was ceremonial, a massive public works project designed to demonstrate communal power and solidarity. But here's the truly bizarre part. The people living in Jericho were engaged in what can only be described as a skull cult. They were burying their dead beneath the floors of their houses, normal enough for Neolithic societies, but then weeks or months later they would dig up the skulls. Just the skulls. They would remove the jawbone, fill the skull with mud or plaster, and carefully model facial features over the bone. Eyes made from shells, painted facial features, individual portrait-like reconstructions. These plastered skulls were then kept in the houses, probably displayed prominently. We found dozens of them, each one individually modelled, each one unique. They weren't religious idols or generic representations of ancestors. They were portraits, specific individuals preserved and remembered. What does this mean? Nobody knows for certain. Maybe they were honouring important ancestors. Maybe they believed the dead needed to remain part of the household. Maybe it was early ancestor worship, the preserved faces of family patriarchs or matriarchs watching over their descendants. What we do know is that it shows sophisticated symbolic thinking, complex ritual behaviour, and a concept of individual identity that persisted beyond death. These weren't simple farmers scratching out a living. They were building a culture, creating meaning, grappling with mortality and memory in ways that still feel eerily human today. By 7000 BCE, Jericho was part of a broader transformation sweeping across Canaan and the wider Fertile Crescent. The Neolithic was in full swing. Dozens of farming villages, each supporting hundreds or sometimes thousands of people, domesticated plants and animals spreading from community to community. Trade networks moving obsidian from Turkey, shells from the Red Sea, and turquoise from the Sinai. And then, around 4500 BCE, something new emerged, the Gasulian culture. The Gasulians were different from the early Neolithic farmers. They weren't just surviving, they were creating. Their villages show evidence of specialised craft production, pottery that wasn't just functional but beautiful, decorated with elaborate geometric patterns. Basalt bowls carved with such precision they look almost machined. Ivory figurines displaying remarkable artistic sophistication. But their most impressive achievement was metallurgy. At sites like Nahal Mishmar in the Judean desert, archaeologists have found hoards of copper objects that shouldn't exist. Over 400 copper artifacts including mace heads, scepters and ritual objects, created using lost wax casting, a sophisticated technique that requires precise temperature control and metallurgical knowledge. This is 4500 BCE. Writing hasn't been invented yet. Cities in the modern sense don't exist, but people in Canaan were creating copper objects using techniques that wouldn't be matched in most of the world for another 1,000 years. The Gasulians were also artists. At Telalet Gasel, archaeologists uncovered wall paintings that seemed to depict religious or mythological scenes. An 8-pointed star surrounded by smaller figures, geometric patterns of impossible complexity, possibly even a dragon-like creature, though the fragmentary preservation makes interpretation difficult. These weren't simple decorations. They were narratives, stories being told through visual art. Religion, mythology, and cosmology being expressed before anyone could write them down. But perhaps the most important thing about prehistoric Canaan wasn't what made it special. It was where it was located. Look at a map. Canaan sits at the crossroads of 3 continents, Africa to the south, Asia to the east, Europe to the north across the Mediterranean. Any migration, any trade route, any army moving between these regions had to pass through this narrow coastal strip. This geography was destiny. Canaan would always be a bridge, a meeting point, a battleground. The people living here would always be influenced by, trading with, and fighting against empires from every direction. By 3500 BCE, as the Bronze Age dawned and the first true cities emerged, the stage was set. Canaan had already seen 6,000 years of settlement, agricultural innovation, artistic achievement, and cultural development. Its people had survived climate catastrophes, invented new technologies, and created complex societies. They had no writing, no monumental temples, no kings whose names we remember. But they had built something more important. They had built a foundation, a cultural substrate that would support everything that came after. Because the Canaanites weren't going to just appear out of nowhere. They were already there, already ancient, already carrying 6,000 years of history in their bones. when the Bronze Age finally arrived, it wouldn't create Canaanite civilization. It would merely name it. Around 3500 BCE, something unprecedented was happening in the Levant. After thousands of years of scattered farming villages, walls started going up. Not just around houses, but around entire settlements. Massive stone fortifications that would have taken thousands of workers' years to build. These weren't defensive walls thrown up in panic. These were statements, declarations that the people inside had something worth protecting, and more importantly, something worth organizing thousands of people to protect. Welcome to the Bronze Age. Welcome to the birth of Canaanite civilization. The first cities emerged slowly, then all at once. Archaeological excavations show a pattern repeated across the region. A small farming village exists for centuries, maybe 1,000 years, just a few hundred people growing wheat and barley, raising sheep and goats. Then within a generation or two, everything changes. The village explodes in size. New quarters get built. Massive public buildings appear. Workshops for specialized craftspeople. Storage facilities for surplus grain. And those walls. Always the walls. Megiddo was one of the first. Perched on a hill overlooking the Jezreel Valley, it controlled one of the most strategic locations in the ancient world. The route connecting Egypt to Mesopotamia ran right past its gates. Whoever controlled Megiddo controlled trade between the world's first great civilizations. The early Canaanites understood this. They transformed a modest village into a fortified city with walls 20 feet thick. Inside, they built what archaeologists call a palace, though it was probably more like a fortress residence for the local ruler. Around it clustered workshops for metalworkers, potters, and weavers. This wasn't just a bigger village. This was something new, a city. Hazor came next, and it made Megiddo look modest. At its height, Hazor would become the largest city in Canaan, covering over 200 acres and housing perhaps 20,000 people. To put that in perspective, that's a population density comparable to many medieval European cities. These weren't primitive settlements. These were urban centres with all the complexity that implies social hierarchies, economic specialisation, political institutions. In other words, civilization. But here's the question nobody's quite answered. Why did this happen? Why did villages that had existed peacefully for centuries suddenly start building walls and organising into hierarchical societies? The standard answer is trade, and there's truth to that. Bronze Age Canaan sat at the crossroads of the ancient world. To the south, Egypt was consolidating into a unified kingdom under the first pharaohs. To the east, Mesopotamian city-states were developing writing and monumental architecture. Canaan was the land bridge connecting them. Any goods moving between these civilizations had to pass through Canaanite territory. That created opportunities, and opportunities created competition, and competition required organization. But there's more to it than economics. Something fundamental was shifting in human consciousness during this period. For the first time, people were thinking beyond their own lifetimes, beyond even their grandchildren's lifetimes. They were building structures designed to last centuries. They were creating institutions that could outlive any individual. They were, in effect, inventing the future. The archaeological record shows this in startling detail. Early Bronze Age Canaan wasn't just building bigger settlements. They were building different kinds of settlements. Specialized sites appear that couldn't have been self-sufficient. Mining camps in the Arabah extracting copper. Coastal settlements focused entirely on fishing and maritime trade. Inland cities that seem to have existed primarily as administrative and religious centers. This is systems thinking. This is people organizing themselves not as isolated communities but as networks of interdependent settlements. And then Egypt noticed. Around 3100 BCE, the first pharaohs unified Upper and Lower Egypt into a single kingdom. Within a few generations, they were looking north toward Canaan with considerable interest. Egyptian records from this period are fragmentary, but they show clear evidence of military expeditions into Canaanite territory. Pottery and luxury goods from Egypt start appearing in Canaanite cities. More ominously, some Canaanite sites from this period show signs of violent destruction, followed by rebuilding in Egyptian style. The pattern would repeat throughout Canaanite history. Egypt was too powerful to ignore and too close to escape. But the relationship wasn't simply one of domination. The Egyptians needed Canaan as much as Canaan needed Egypt. Cedar wood from the Lebanese mountains, copper from Timnah, wine, oil, and grain. And most importantly, access to trade routes connecting Egypt to the wider world. So Egyptian influence in Canaan during this early period was probably more subtle than later conquests. Less military occupation, more economic partnership. With occasional punitive expeditions when Canaanite cities got too independent for Egyptian comfort. But the Canaanites weren't just passive recipients of Egyptian influence. They were building their own networks, developing their own expertise. By 3000 BCE, Canaanite merchants were sailing the eastern Mediterranean, establishing trade connections with Cyprus, Crete, and the Anatolian coast. They were moving overland to Mesopotamia, bringing back ideas and technologies that transformed Canaanite society. The evidence is written in metal. Bronze, the alloy that gives this age its name, requires both copper and tin. Copper was available locally in the Arabah, but tin had to be imported, probably from as far away as Afghanistan or Anatolia. To maintain a bronze industry, Canaanite cities needed to sustain trade networks spanning thousands of miles. This required infrastructure, established routes, trusted intermediaries, systems of credit and debt, in other words, international commerce. The Canaanites were among the first peoples to master it, and they needed to keep records, which brings us to one of Canaan's most extraordinary contributions to human civilization. Writing. Now, the Canaanites didn't invent writing. That honor goes to the Sumerians in Mesopotamia around 3200 BCE, or possibly to the Egyptians around the same time. Early writing systems were incredibly complex. Sumerian cuneiform used hundreds of symbols. Egyptian hieroglyphics had over 700. These systems required years of training to master. They were the exclusive domain of specialized scribes, creating an educated elite who controlled access to recorded information. But sometime around 2000 BCE, in the copper mines of Serabit el-Qadim in the Sinai Peninsula, somebody had a revolutionary idea. What if, instead of symbols representing entire words or syllables, each symbol represented just a single sound? You could reduce the entire system to maybe 30 symbols, one for each basic sound in the language. Anyone could learn it in weeks instead of years. This was the Proto-Sinaitic script, the world's first alphabet, and it was probably invented by Canaanite workers or merchants operating in Egyptian territory. The early inscriptions are crude, scratched into rock faces by people who were clearly experimenting with a new technology. But the implications were staggering. For the first time, writing could be democratized. It wasn't the exclusive tool of the elite anymore. Merchants could keep their own records. Craftspeople could mark their goods. Even ordinary people could learn to read and write. Every alphabet you've ever seen descends from this Canaanite innovation. The Phoenician alphabet, the Aramaic alphabet, Greek, Latin, Arabic, Hebrew, Cyrillic, Devanagari. All of them trace their ancestry back to those crude scratches in the Sinai, made by Canaanite workers who decided that knowledge shouldn't be locked away behind thousands of complex symbols. Inside the growing cities, Canaanite society was stratifying into distinct classes. At the top sat the king, though that's probably too grand a term for the early period. These were more like chief warlords, men who controlled the city through a combination of military prowess, religious authority and economic power. They lived in the palaces at the city centres, surrounded by retainers and servants. Below them came the priests. Bronze Age Canaanite religion was already complex, with multiple deities requiring constant ritual attention. Temples needed to be maintained, sacrifices had to be performed, festivals had to be organised. This created a priestly class with considerable power and wealth. In some cities, the temple seems to have rivaled, or even exceeded the palace in importance. Then came the merchants and craftspeople, the specialised workers who made the urban economy function, metal workers who knew the secrets of bronze casting, potters who produced the vessels for storing oil and wine, textile workers who wove the cloth that was one of Canaan's major exports. These people had skills that gave them economic leverage. They weren't elite, but they weren't peasants either. They were the emerging middle class of the ancient world. At the bottom, as always, came the farmers, the vast majority of the population who worked the fields surrounding the cities, producing the grain surpluses that made urban life possible. They probably lived much as their ancestors had lived for thousands of years. Small villages, extended family, compounds, the eternal rhythms of planting and harvest. But now they paid taxes to the city. Part of their harvest went to support the king, the priests, the craftspeople, the whole urban superstructure that had grown up around them. And then, around 2000 BCE, everything got complicated again. New people started arriving. The Amorites. Nobody's quite sure where they came from. The name means something like Westerners in Akkadian, but that's not particularly helpful. They seem to have been semi-nomadic pastoralists from somewhere in Syria or the Arabian desert who decided to start settling in Canaanite territory. Egyptian and Mesopotamian records mention them increasingly frequently. Canaanite cities show evidence of demographic shifts. New pottery styles appear, new burial practices, new names showing up in the archaeological record. This wasn't a violent conquest. There's no evidence of massive destruction layers or wholesale population replacement. Instead, it seems to have been a gradual infiltration, Amorite groups settling on the margins of Canaanite territory, intermarrying with local populations, slowly integrating into urban life while maintaining distinct cultural identities. Over a few centuries they went from outsiders to insiders. By 1800 BCE, many Canaanite cities were ruled by dynasties with Amorite names. The genetic evidence supports this picture. Modern DNA studies show that Bronze Age Canaanite populations were remarkably diverse, with ancestry from multiple sources. The locals who had been there for thousands of years, migrants from Mesopotamia bringing agricultural innovations, Egyptian influence from the south, and these new Amorite populations adding another layer of complexity. Canaan was becoming a melting pot, a place where different peoples, languages and traditions mixed and merged. This diversity would become one of Canaan's defining characteristics. It made the region politically fractious, never unified under a single ruler. But it also made it incredibly dynamic, a place where ideas from across the ancient world collided and sparked innovations that changed history. By 2000 BCE, the transformation was complete. The scattered farming villages of the Neolithic had become a constellation of city-states. Trade networks stretched from the Nile to the Euphrates, from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf. The first alphabetic writing system was taking shape, and a distinctive Canaanite culture was emerging, neither wholly Egyptian nor wholly Mesopotamian, but something uniquely its own. The Bronze Age dawn had arrived, and Canaan was about to enter its golden age. But that flowering of culture and power would attract attention from neighbours who saw Canaan not as a civilization to be respected, but as a prize to be conquered. The shadow of empire was about to fall across the land of purple. Let's talk about something that's going to blow your mind. The God of the Bible, the one worshipped by billions of people today, has a name. And that name is El. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, literally. The Hebrew word for God, Elohim, is just the plural form of El. And El wasn't originally Hebrew at all. He was Canaanite, the supreme deity of the very civilization the Bible tells us the Israelites were supposed to destroy. Picture this. You're a Canaanite living in the city of Ugarit around 1400 BCE. When you look up at the stars, you're not seeing random lights in the sky. You're seeing the divine assembly, the council of gods that governs the cosmos. And sitting at the head of that council, on a throne at the summit of the cosmic mountain, is El, the father of gods and humans, the ancient of days, the bull god whose word is law. El wasn't a jealous god. He wasn't interested in human worship the way his children were. He was old, wise, distant. The texts describe him sitting in his tent at the source of the two rivers, the mythical place where all waters originate. He's called the bull, not because he's aggressive, but because he's potent, patriarchal, the progenitor of everything that exists. When other gods have disputes, they come to El for judgment. When humans need cosmic-level intervention, they petition El through prayers and offerings. But here's where it gets interesting. El had a wife, her name was Asherah, and she wasn't some minor goddess tucked away in obscure texts. She was the mother of the gods, the queen of heaven, one of the most widely worshipped deities in the entire ancient Near East. Asherah poles, sacred trees representing the goddess, stood in practically every Canaanite town. People prayed to her for fertility, for healthy children, for protection of their families. She was as fundamental to Canaanite religion as El himself. Now, if you've read the Hebrew Bible carefully, you might notice something odd. The text keeps mentioning these Asherah poles that the Israelites are constantly being condemned for worshipping. King after king gets criticized for allowing Asherah worship to continue. The prophets rail against her, but she keeps showing up. Archaeological excavations have found inscriptions in ancient Israel that read Yahweh and his Asherah, not Yahweh versus Asherah, Yahweh and his Asherah, as if they were a pair, as if the God of Israel had a wife, and that wife was the Canaanite mother goddess. The implications are staggering. The religion that became Judaism, and later Christianity and Islam, didn't emerge from nothing. It emerged from Canaanite religion, borrowing its divine names, its cosmic imagery, its very concept of how gods relate to humans. But it did something radical. It took the entire divine assembly and collapsed it down to one. El absorbed all the other gods, became the only god, and everyone else got demoted to angels, demons, or literary memories. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, because El, for all his cosmic authority, wasn't the god most Canaanites actually prayed to on a daily basis. That honor belonged to his son, Baal. If El was the distant patriarch, Baal was the young warrior prince who actually got things done. Baal-Hadad, the storm god, the rider of clouds, the one who brought the rain that kept people alive. In the agricultural world of ancient Canaan, where a few weeks without rain meant famine and death, Baal wasn't just important, he was everything. When storm clouds gathered on the horizon, that was Baal riding his chariot across the sky. When lightning struck, that was Baal's weapon. When thunder rolled, that was Baal's voice announcing his presence. The Baal cycle, a collection of texts discovered at Ugarit, tells his story, and it's epic. Baal doesn't start out as king of the gods. He has to fight for that position. His great enemy is Yam, the god of the sea and chaos. Yam represents everything that threatens human civilization, the destructive waters that flood cities, sink ships, destroy crops. Baal battles Yam in a cosmic showdown, wielding magical weapons forged by the craftsman god Kothawakasis. Baal wins. Order defeats chaos. Civilization triumphs over the destructive sea. But Baal's greatest battle is still to come, because there's another god who challenges his authority. Mocha, death itself, the god of the underworld, sterility, and the dry season. Every year Baal must descend into the underworld and face Mot, and every year Baal dies. When Baal dies, the rains stop, crops wither, the earth becomes barren, El and Asherah mourn. The divine assembly wears sackcloth. All of creation groans under the rule of death. But then, after months in the underworld, Baal returns. He defeats Mot, not permanently, because death can never be permanently defeated, but enough to restore life to the world. The rains return, crops grow, life continues. This isn't just mythology. This is the agricultural cycle transformed into divine drama. Every farmer in Canaan understood this story viscerally, because they lived it every single year. Now, if some of this sounds familiar, it should. The combat myth, where a storm god defeats the sea, shows up everywhere in biblical literature. Psalm 74 describes Yahweh crushing the heads of Leviathan, the sea monster. Psalm 89 mentions Yahweh defeating Rahab, another chaos creature. The book of Job describes God's power over the primordial sea. Isaiah uses the same language. Even in Revelation, the final victory involves a new creation where there is no more sea. The sea, representing chaos and death, must be defeated before paradise can be restored. The biblical authors weren't plagiarizing. They were inheriting a mythological language that had been part of their culture for thousands of years. They just reassigned all of Baal's victories to Yahweh. But the divine realm wasn't just El, Asherah, Baal, and Mot. There were dozens of other deities, each with specific domains and responsibilities. Shaphash, the sun goddess, who travelled through the underworld, each night and knew all secrets. Anat, Baal's warrior sister, fierce and bloodthirsty, who helped him in his battles. Kothawakasis, the divine craftsman who built palaces for the gods and weapons for heroes. Resheph, the god of plague and disease. Dagon, the grain god. The list goes on. These weren't abstract concepts. To the Canaanites, these were real beings with personalities, preferences, and power. You didn't just believe in them. You negotiated with them. You made offerings to Baal for rain. You prayed to Asherah for children. You petitioned Shaphash if you needed justice, because she saw everything. You feared Resheph during disease outbreaks, and made offerings to appease him. And this brings us to the temples, the places where heaven and earth connected. Canaanite temples weren't like modern churches or synagogues. You didn't go there for weekly services or to hear sermons. Temples were literally the houses of the gods. Each major city had temples dedicated to their patron deities. Inside, hidden behind curtains in the innermost chamber, stood the divine statue, the physical manifestation of the god's presence. Only priests could enter that space. Everyone else remained in the outer courts, bringing offerings that the priests would present to the deity on their behalf. Now we need to address the elephant in the room: sacred prostitution. For centuries, scholars claim that Canaanite temples employed sacred prostitutes, women who had ritual sex with worshippers as part of fertility rites. The Bible seems to reference this practice. Classical Greek and Roman authors described it. It became one of the most repeated facts about Canaanite religion, used to paint them as morally degenerate compared to the pure Israelites. There's just one problem. The archaeological evidence doesn't support it at all. Decades of excavations at Canaanite temple sites have found exactly zero evidence of sacred prostitution. No brothels attached to temples, no inscriptions describing such practices, no artwork depicting it. The whole concept seems to have been a misunderstanding, possibly based on Greek writers misinterpreting foreign customs, or biblical authors using prostitution as a metaphor for religious infidelity. What archaeology does show is that Canaanite temples functioned as economic centres, storing grain and wealth, organising trade, and employing scribes, craftsmen, and administrators. They were complex institutions that played crucial roles in urban life. Were there rituals involving sexuality? Probably. Fertility was central to ancient agricultural societies, and religious practices often reflected this concern. But systematic temple prostitution? The evidence just isn't there. But then there's the darker question: child sacrifice, the Tophet, Moloch. The Bible repeatedly accuses the Canaanites of sacrificing their children to gods by burning them alive. The prophets describe these practices with horror. Archaeological sites across the Phoenician world, from Carthage to Sicily, have revealed cemeteries filled with urns containing the cremated remains of infants and young children. Is this proof that the biblical authors were right? Here's where we need to be honest and careful. The archaeological evidence is real. The urns exist. Chemical analysis confirms they contain human remains. But the interpretation is fiercely debated. Some scholars argue this is direct evidence of child sacrifice, exactly as described in ancient texts. Others point out that infant mortality rates in the ancient world were catastrophic, perhaps 40–50% of children dying before age 5. They suggest these might be burial grounds for children who died naturally, with cremation being a special ritual for particularly tragic deaths. The truth is probably complex and possibly varied by time and place. There's evidence that in extreme circumstances, during sieges or catastrophic famines, some communities did practice child sacrifice. Ancient texts from outside the Bible confirm this. But was it routine, casual, a regular feature of normal religious life? The evidence suggests not. More likely it was a desperate response to desperate situations, a horrific last resort when communities felt they had no other way to appease the gods or end a crisis. What's clear is that Canaanite religion was neither the primitive demon worship the Bible describes nor the enlightened nature worship some modern pagans imagine. It was a sophisticated theological system that gave meaning to human experience, explained the natural world, and provided frameworks for dealing with the fundamental questions of existence. Why does it rain? Because Baal rides his clouds. Why do crops fail? Because Baal has descended to the underworld. Why do we suffer? Because we're caught in the eternal battle between order and chaos, life and death, fertility and sterility. And when a new god emerged from this divine assembly, a god who claimed to be the only god, who absorbed El's cosmic authority and Baal's active intervention and Asherah's protective care all into a single divine personality, that God carried with him all the mythological language, all the cosmic imagery, all the theological concepts that Canaanite religion had spent thousands of years developing. The gods of Canaan didn't disappear, they transformed, they merged. They became the angels and demons of later tradition, the cosmic powers and principalities that still populate religious imagination today. Their stories became the Bible's stories. Their imagery became the Bible's imagery. Their very names became the Bible's names for God. But before that transformation could happen, Canaanite civilization had to reach its peak, and that's exactly what it did. For several centuries between 2000 and 1550 BCE, Canaan experienced what historians call its golden age. Cities flourished, trade networks expanded, culture and art reached new heights. This was Canaan at its absolute zenith, before the empires came, before the collapse, before everything changed forever. Around 2000 BCE, something extraordinary was happening in Canaan. After centuries of gradual development, the Canaanite cities weren't just growing anymore, they were exploding. Population densities in some urban centres tripled within a single generation. Wealth poured in from trade routes connecting 3 continents, and the Canaanites responded by building something the Levant had never seen before. True cities, not just fortified towns or trading posts, but massive urban centres with populations in the tens of thousands, sophisticated infrastructure, and defensive systems that would make a modern military engineer jealous. This was the Middle Bronze Age, roughly 2000 to 1550 BCE, and it represents the absolute zenith of Canaanite civilization. The Golden Age. The period when Canaan wasn't just surviving on the margins of greater empires, but standing as a power in its own right, a civilization wealthy enough, organized enough, and militarily formidable enough to shape the politics of the entire ancient Near East. The most visible sign of this transformation was the fortifications. Canaanite cities from this period were surrounded by defensive systems unlike anything that had come before. We're not talking about simple walls. These were massive earthen ramparts called glacis, sloping structures sometimes reaching 30 to 40 feet high, faced with smooth plaster that made them nearly impossible to scale. Behind these ramparts rose thick stone walls, often 15 to 20 feet thick at the base, with towers positioned at regular intervals for defensive fire. Archaeological excavations at sites like Tel Dan, Megiddo, and Giza reveal gate systems so elaborate they required attackers to navigate multiple choke points, all under constant fire from defenders above. These gates weren't just defensive, they were architectural statements, massive stone structures decorated with elaborate masonry, designed to impress visitors and intimidate potential enemies. Anyone approaching a major Canaanite city in this period would have understood immediately that they were dealing with a sophisticated, wealthy, and militarily competent civilization. But the real jewel in Canaan's Golden Age crown was Hazor. Located in the Upper Galilee, Hazor during the Middle Bronze Age was nothing short of staggering. The lower city alone covered approximately 175 acres, with an upper acropolis adding another 30 acres. Total urban area, over 200 acres, making it larger than contemporary Babylon, larger than any city in Egypt, the largest urban centre in the entire Levant, and one of the great metropolises of the ancient world. Population estimates for Hazor at its height range from 20,000 to 40,000 people. To put that in perspective, most Canaanite cities of the period had populations between 1,000 and 5,000. Hazor was operating on a completely different scale. This was a true city, with all the complexity that implies. Specialized craft quarters where artisans produced pottery, textiles, and metalwork. Administrative districts with scribes recording trade transactions and tax payments. Temple complexes serving multiple deities. Residential areas stratified by wealth, from palatial estates to crowded worker housing, and all of it surrounded by those massive fortifications that announced Hazor's status to anyone who approached. What made Hazor so successful? Location, location, location. The city sat astride the main trade route connecting Mesopotamia to Egypt, the Via Maris. Every caravan moving between the great powers of the Bronze Age passed through Hazor's territory. The city's rulers could tax that trade, regulate it, protect it, and profit enormously from it. Hazor wasn't just a city. It was a commercial empire, a node in a network of exchange that spanned the known world. And this brings us to one of the most fascinating and underappreciated aspects of Canaanite Golden Age, their international connections. Canaan in the Middle Bronze Age wasn't isolated or provincial. It was cosmopolitan, connected, plugged into diplomatic and commercial networks that linked it to every major power of the ancient Near East. Archaeological evidence from Canaanite sites reveals imported goods from staggering distances. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, tin from Anatolia, ivory from Egypt or possibly East Africa, copper from Cyprus, silver from Anatolia, luxury textiles from Mesopotamia. This wasn't occasional trade, this was systematic, large-scale commercial exchange. Canaanite merchants were operating in foreign markets. Foreign merchants were establishing permanent residences in Canaanite cities. Some urban centres had what amounted to foreign quarters, residential districts where traders from other regions lived year-round, maintaining the commercial connections that made everyone wealthy. But the international connections went deeper than just trade. The Canaanites were also diplomatic players. Cuneiform tablets found at various sites show Canaanite rulers corresponding with their counterparts in Mesopotamia and Anatolia. These weren't vassal states begging for protection. These were diplomatic equals negotiating alliances, arranging royal marriages, coordinating military campaigns. The Canaanites had figured out how to play the great power game, using their strategic location to make themselves indispensable to everyone while submitting completely to no one. And then there's the Hyksos. This is where the story gets really wild. Sometime around 1650 BCE, a group of Asiatic peoples, almost certainly including substantial Canaanite elements, invaded Egypt. Not raided, invaded. They conquered the Nile Delta, established their own dynasty, and ruled as pharaohs of Egypt for over a century. We know them as the Hyksos, from the Egyptian phrase meaning rulers of foreign lands, and they represent the single most dramatic political achievement of Canaanite civilization. The details are murky. Ancient Egyptian sources written after the Hyksos were expelled painted them as barbaric invaders who destroyed Egyptian culture. But archaeology tells a different story. The Hyksos didn't destroy Egyptian civilization. They adopted it. They built in Egyptian styles, used Egyptian titles, worshipped Egyptian gods alongside their Canaanite deities. They were cosmopolitan, sophisticated, using their position to foster trade connections between Egypt and the broader Near East. More importantly, they brought new military technologies to Egypt. The Hyksos introduced the composite bow, capable of penetrating armor at distances that made Egyptian weapons obsolete. They brought the horse-drawn chariot, revolutionizing Bronze Age warfare. They imported bronze working techniques that made Egyptian metallurgy more sophisticated. When the Egyptians finally expelled the Hyksos around 1550 BCE, they immediately adopted all these military innovations. The aggressive, expansionist new kingdom that would dominate Canaan for the next 4 centuries was built on technologies the Hyksos had brought from the north. So who were the Hyksos exactly? The evidence suggests they were a coalition of Asiatic peoples, predominantly Canaanite, possibly including some Hurrian and Amorite elements. Their names, as recorded in Egyptian sources, are overwhelmingly Semitic, specifically Northwest Semitic, the language family that includes Canaanite. Their pottery styles match Canaanite forms. Their religious practices, as far as we can reconstruct them, included worship of Baal and other Canaanite deities. These weren't random nomads who stumbled into Egypt. These were Canaanites, probably from the northern cities, who saw an opportunity in Egyptian political weakness and seized it brilliantly. Back in Canaan itself, life during the Golden Age reached levels of sophistication that wouldn't be matched again for centuries. The archaeological record from Middle Bronze Age sites reveals a society that had mastered the arts of civilized living. Pottery from this period is technically excellent, well-fired, beautifully decorated, showing both local styles and influences from across the region. Some pieces are so thin and delicate they seem almost fragile, evidence of potters working at the absolute peak of their craft. But pottery was just the beginning. Canaanite artisans of this period created works of breathtaking beauty. Ivory carvings depicting mythological scenes, geometric patterns, and stylized animals. Some of these pieces are so intricate they must have required years of training and months of careful work. They show up in elite tombs and palace contexts, markers of wealth and refined taste. Jewellery from Middle Bronze Age Canaan reveals similar sophistication. Gold worked into elaborate earrings, necklaces and bracelets. Semi-precious. Stones cut and polished with remarkable precision. Silver hammered into thin sheets and decorated with repoussé designs. This wasn't crude metalwork. This was high art, created by specialists who had spent lifetimes perfecting their techniques. And then there's the architecture. Inside those massive fortifications, wealthy Canaanites were building houses that would have been comfortable by almost any standard. Stone foundations supporting mud brick walls, multiple rooms organised around central courtyards. Some houses had 2 stories, with wooden stairs leading to upper chambers. Roofs were flat, used for sleeping in hot weather, for drying food, for socialising in the evenings. Wealthier homes had private wells or cisterns, ensuring water supply even during sieges. The truly elite lived in something approaching palatial splendour. Archaeological excavations have revealed administrative buildings and elite residences with dozens of rooms, elaborate columned halls, private temples or shrines, storage facilities capable of holding months or years' worth of supplies. These were the homes of Canaan's ruling class, the families who controlled trade, commanded military forces, negotiated with foreign powers, and accumulated wealth beyond the imagination of common citizens. But what about those common citizens? What was daily life actually like for ordinary Canaanites during the Golden Age? The archaeological evidence, combined with texts from contemporary civilizations, gives us a surprisingly detailed picture. Most people lived in much simpler houses, often single-room structures where entire families ate, slept, and worked together. Privacy was minimal. Personal space was a luxury few could afford. Daily life revolved around work. Most Canaanites were farmers, shepherds, or craftspeople. They rose at dawn, worked until sunset, and spent their evenings maintaining tools, preparing food, and participating in the social life of their communities. Diet was simple, but adequate. Bread made from wheat or barley formed the staple, supplemented with lentils, chickpeas, onions, garlic, and seasonal vegetables. Those near the coast ate fish. Most families kept some livestock, goats or sheep, providing occasional meat and daily dairy products. Wine and beer were common beverages, safer than water and providing both calories and social lubrication. Children worked from an early age, helping with agriculture, learning crafts from their parents, contributing to household economies. Education, in any formal sense, was available only to the elite. Scribes trained in specialized schools, learning the cuneiform script used for international diplomacy and trade. Most people remained illiterate their entire lives, but life wasn't all work. Canaanites gathered for religious festivals, market days, and seasonal celebrations. They told stories, sang songs, played games. Archaeological excavations have turned up children's toys, gaming pieces, and musical instruments. Even in an ancient agricultural society, people found time for play, for art, for the simple pleasures that make life bearable. This was Canaan at its height, a network of wealthy, fortified cities connected by trade and diplomacy to the great powers of the Bronze Age world, a civilization that could conquer Egypt, negotiate with Mesopotamian kingdoms, and create art that still impresses us 3,500 years later. A society complex enough to support specialists in everything from bronze working to international commerce. But this golden age existed in a dangerous world. Egypt to the south was beginning to recover from the chaos of the Hyksos period. The pharaohs of the new kingdom were organizing, training, preparing for campaigns of expansion and revenge, and when they came, they would bring an end to Canaanite independence that would last for centuries. The Golden Age was about to give way to something much darker. The age of Egyptian domination was approaching. Everything was about to change for the Canaanites. For nearly 500 years, they'd been living in their Golden Age, building prosperous cities, trading across the Mediterranean, refining their culture and religion. They'd survived invasions before, adapted to new rulers, maintained their identity through countless upheavals. But they'd never faced anything like what was coming from the south. Egypt was waking up, and when Egypt woke up angry, the entire ancient world trembled. Picture the scene. It's 1457 BCE. Spring. The Jezreel Valley in northern Canaan is green with crops, roads busy with merchant caravans moving between the great cities. At Megiddo, one of the most strategically important fortresses in Canaan, a coalition of Canaanite kings has gathered their armies. Over 300 rulers from across the region, united for once, determined to stop the Egyptian invasion before it can devastate their homeland. They've chosen their ground carefully. Megiddo sits on a narrow pass, the only practical route for a large army to enter the valley. The Canaanites have blocked the pass, fortified their positions, prepared for a siege. They have numbers on their side, local knowledge, defensive advantage. By every reasonable military calculation, they should be able to hold. But they're not facing a reasonable enemy. They're facing Thutmose III, the Napoleon of ancient Egypt, leading an army that has spent the last 20 years conquering everything in its path. The Egyptian records tell us what happened next in brutal detail. Thutmose didn't do what the Canaanites expected. He didn't besiege Megiddo or try to force the pass. Instead, he divided his army into 3 columns and led the main force through a different route entirely, a narrow mountain trail so dangerous his own generals begged him not to attempt it. The path was so tight that horses had to proceed single file. If the Canaanites had discovered them mid-crossing, they could have slaughtered the entire Egyptian army. But Thutmose gambled that surprise would be worth the risk. He was right. The Egyptian army emerged from the mountains directly behind the Canaanite positions at dawn. The coalition forces, expecting an attack from the front, found themselves caught between 2 Egyptian armies with no room to maneuver. The battle lasted less than a day. The Canaanite coalition shattered. Kings who had been bragging about their military prowess days earlier were running for their lives, abandoning their chariots, their weapons, even their armour in desperate attempts to reach Megiddo's walls before the Egyptian cavalry cut them down. The Egyptian records claim Thutmose could have taken Megiddo that same day if his soldiers hadn't stopped to loot the abandoned Canaanite camp. By the time discipline was restored, the surviving kings had barricaded themselves inside the city. The siege that followed lasted 7 months. 7 months of slowly tightening Egyptian control while the Canaanite rulers inside watched their world collapse. When Megiddo finally fell, Thutmose didn't just accept tribute and move on like previous conquerors. He restructured the entire political landscape of Canaan. Every king, every city-state, every local ruler was brought into a new system of Egyptian imperial administration. Canaan wasn't being raided anymore, it was being colonized. This was the beginning of 350 years of Egyptian domination, a period that would fundamentally transform Canaanite society and set the stage for everything that came after, including the emergence of Israel. The Egyptian colonial system was sophisticated and brutal in equal measure. They didn't try to replace local rulers entirely. That would have been too expensive, required too many Egyptian administrators, too many garrison troops. Instead, they created a system of vassal kings, Canaanite rulers who stayed on their thrones but answered to Egyptian governors. The key to the whole system was tribute. Every year, enormous quantities of goods flowed from Canaan to Egypt: grain, olive oil, wine, timber, copper, silver, gold. Finished goods like textiles and pottery, luxury items like ivory and precious stones, and slaves, always slaves, war captives, criminals, debtors, sometimes just people seized because the local ruler needed to meet his quota. To ensure compliance, Egypt established a network of garrison towns throughout Canaan: Beth Shean, Gaza, Joppa. These weren't just military posts. They were administrative centres staffed by Egyptian bureaucrats who kept meticulous records of every transaction, every shipment of goods, every local dispute that might threaten Egyptian interests. And we can read those records today. Not the Egyptian administrative documents, most of those are lost, but something even better, the Amarna letters. These are the desperate diplomatic correspondence of Canaanite kings writing to their Egyptian overlords, and they reveal a world in crisis. The letters were discovered in Egypt at the site of Akhetaten, the short-lived capital built by the pharaoh Akhenaten. Nearly 400 clay tablets written in Akkadian, the diplomatic language of the ancient Near East. Most are from Canaanite rulers, and they paint a picture of a colonial system falling apart. Reading them is like eavesdropping on a world on the edge of collapse. The Canaanite kings are constantly complaining, accusing each other of disloyalty, begging for Egyptian military support, reporting on invasions and rebellions. The tone is servile but desperate. These are men who know they're losing control. One king writes that he's been attacked by his neighbours and all his lands have been seized. He begs the pharaoh to send even 50 soldiers, just 50, to help him survive. Another reports that his entire city is in revolt and he's barricaded himself in his own palace. A third claims his fellow vassal kings are conspiring with Egypt's enemies and should be punished. But the most intriguing references are to a group called the Habiru. The Habiru appear again and again in the Amarna letters and other ancient Near Eastern texts from this period. They're described as outlaws, bandits, rebels, displaced persons. Some Canaanite kings claim the Habiru are invading their territories, burning cities, disrupting trade routes. Others are accused of hiring Habiru as mercenaries or even joining them. The identity of the Habiru is one of the great mysteries of ancient Near Eastern studies. The name sounds like Hebrew, and for over a century scholars have debated whether these are the same people. Are the Habiru the early Israelites, or just one of many displaced groups in a chaotic period? Or is the similarity in names just a linguistic coincidence? Here's what we know. The term Habiru isn't ethnic. It's a social category. It seems to refer to people outside the normal social structure, individuals who've left or been expelled from their communities, refugees, escaped slaves, bankrupt farmers, deserters, outlaws. In a stable society, there might be a few dozen such people wandering the margins, but in a collapsing colonial system there could be thousands, and the Amarna period was definitely a time of collapse. The letters make that clear. Egyptian control was weakening. Local kings were fighting each other. Trade routes were becoming too dangerous to use. Whole regions were falling into chaos, and in that chaos, groups of displaced people were finding opportunities. Some Habiru became bandits, raiding settlements and caravans. Others became mercenaries, selling their services to whichever local king would pay. Some may have formed their own communities in the hill country, away from Egyptian garrisons and local kings. They were the dispossessed, people with nothing to lose and everything to gain from disrupting the existing order. Whether they were Proto-Israelites or not, the Habiru represent something important. They show us that Canaanite society under Egyptian rule was fracturing, producing large numbers of people alienated from the system. These were exactly the conditions that could give rise to new social movements, new identities, new ways of organizing society. But despite the chaos, despite the tribute demands and garrison towns and constant warfare, Canaanite culture didn't disappear. It adapted. Egyptian officials might control the cities, but they didn't control the culture. Canaanite religion continued to flourish. Baal and El and Asherah were still worshipped in temples across the land. Canaanite craftsmen still produced their distinctive pottery and metalwork. Canaanite languages were still spoken in the markets and homes. In fact, Egyptian domination might have strengthened Canaanite cultural identity in some ways. When you're being ruled by foreigners, maintaining your traditional customs becomes an act of resistance. The temples weren't just religious centers anymore. They were repositories of Canaanite identity, places where local traditions could be preserved and transmitted even as Egyptian power structures dominated the political landscape. And then came Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh, the religious revolutionary who decided to throw out thousands of years of Egyptian polytheism and worship only one god, the Aten, the sun disk. Akhenaten's reign from 1353 to 1336 BCE coincides exactly with the Amarna letters period. That's not a coincidence. The letters were found at his capital because that's where they were sent. But here's the thing. While Akhenaten was obsessing over his religious revolution, building a new capital, composing hymns to his one god, the Egyptian empire was falling apart. The Canaanite kings writing to him were getting increasingly desperate. Their letters report invasions, rebellions, famines, plagues. They beg for military support, for supplies, for any sign that Egypt still cared about its colonies. But Akhenaten was too focused on his religious reforms to respond effectively. Egyptian garrisons were withdrawn to support the pharaoh's building projects. Military resources were diverted. Colonial administration was neglected. Did Akhenaten's monotheism influence Canaan? Some scholars think so. The idea of worshipping only one god was radical in the ancient world. Most cultures practice polytheism, but here was Egypt, the great power of the age, experimenting with monotheism. Could that have planted seeds that would later grow into Israelite monotheism? It's possible, but the evidence is thin. What's clear is that Akhenaten's religious obsession created a power vacuum that destabilized the entire region. By the time Akhenaten died and his successors tried to restore traditional Egyptian religion and imperial control, the damage was done. Canaan had experienced decades of weak Egyptian oversight. Local rulers had learned they could act independently. Displaced groups like the Habaru had established themselves in regions beyond Egyptian control. The colonial system was permanently weakened. Egypt would maintain nominal control over Canaan for another century, but it was never the same. The pharaohs who followed Akhenaten tried to restore order. Ramesses too would later claim great victories in Canaan and sign a famous peace treaty with the Hittites dividing up the region. But these were the actions of an empire in decline, trying to maintain influence rather than exercise direct control. Because something else was happening, something that would make Egyptian colonial troubles seem trivial. New peoples were moving into the eastern Mediterranean. Raiders from across the sea were beginning to attack coastal cities. Climate change was destabilizing societies from Greece to Mesopotamia. The entire Bronze Age world system was starting to crack. The Canaanites had survived Egyptian domination, adapted their culture, maintained their identity through centuries of foreign rule. They dealt with rebellions and famines and administrative chaos. But what was coming next was different. What was coming next wasn't just another empire trying to control them. It was the collapse of civilization itself, the end of the Bronze Age, the arrival of the Sea Peoples, the apocalypse that would destroy the world the Canaanites had built and transform their land forever. Picture this. You're standing on the walls of Ugarit in 1192 BCE. It's one of the greatest cities in the world, a thriving port where ships from Egypt, Mesopotamia and the Aegean Islands crowd the harbour. The palace library holds thousands of clay tablets recording diplomatic correspondence, commercial transactions, religious texts, and administrative documents in 7 different languages. The streets bustle with merchants trading copper from Cyprus, silver from Anatolia, grain from Egypt, purple dye from Tyre. This is Bronze Age civilization at its absolute peak. Interconnected, prosperous, sophisticated beyond anything that had come before. Then you see the smoke on the horizon, not from one direction but from everywhere at once. The trading ships stop coming, the diplomatic letters become increasingly desperate, and within a single generation, maybe 30 years, everything collapses. Ugarit burns. So does every other major city from Greece to Mesopotamia. The palace falls. The library bakes in the flames, accidentally preserving those final desperate letters for archaeologists to find 3,000 years later. The survivors scatter into the hills, and when the smoke clears, civilization itself has essentially ceased to exist across the entire eastern Mediterranean. This wasn't a local disaster. This wasn't one empire conquering another, replacing one administration with a different one. This was the Bronze Age collapse, the greatest catastrophe in ancient history, when the interconnected world of the late Bronze Age disintegrated so completely that it took centuries to rebuild. And Canaan, sitting right at the crossroads of this Bronze Age world, got hit harder than almost anywhere else. The destruction was staggering. Archaeological surveys of late Bronze Age sites in Canaan tell a horrifying story. Hazor, the largest city in Canaan, prosperous metropolis of maybe 20,000 people, burned so thoroughly that the destruction layer is still visible 3,000 years later. Megiddo destroyed. Lachish destroyed. Bethshean destroyed. Ashkelon destroyed. City after city shows the same pattern. Massive conflagration layers, buildings collapsed, walls breached, and then nothing. No rebuilding, no reoccupation, just abandonment or tiny settlements on top of the ruins, settlements so small they barely register archaeologically. The numbers are staggering. Of the 87 late Bronze Age settlements that archaeologists have identified in Canaan, more than 60 were destroyed or abandoned during this period. That's a 70% collapse in urban settlement. The population of the region probably dropped by half, maybe more. The trade networks that had connected Canaan to Egypt, Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the Aegean islands simply ceased to function. Imported pottery disappears from the archaeological record. International correspondence stops. The system that had sustained Bronze Age civilization for centuries came apart at the seams. But here's the question that's haunted archaeologists for nearly a century. What caused it? Who or what could have destroyed the entire Bronze Age world so completely and so quickly? For decades, the answer seemed obvious. The Sea Peoples. Ancient texts, particularly Egyptian inscriptions from the reign of Pharaoh Ramesses III, describe massive invasions by mysterious groups of warriors and migrants coming from the sea. The inscriptions list their names: Peleset, Cheker, Shekelesh, Denyen, Weshesh, groups whose origins remain frustratingly obscure. The reliefs at Medinet Habu show great naval and land battles. Ramesses claims to have defeated them, saving Egypt from destruction, but acknowledging that everywhere else fell. The traditional narrative went like this: these sea peoples, whoever they were, swept through the eastern Mediterranean like a tidal wave of destruction. They attacked by sea and by land, bringing their families in ox-drawn carts, suggesting this wasn't just raiding, but migration. They destroyed the Hittite Empire in Anatolia. They burned the great cities of coastal Syria. They obliterated Ugarit, Alashia, and countless other centers of Bronze Age civilization. Only Egypt, under Ramesses III, managed to turn them back, but just barely. And some of these sea peoples didn't go home. They settled in Canaan. The Peleset became the Philistines, establishing themselves in 5 major cities along the southern coast: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. These weren't Canaanites. The archaeology makes that crystal clear. Their pottery is completely different, showing strong connections to the Aegean world. Their architecture is different. Their burial customs are different. Even their diet was different. They ate pork, which Canaanites generally avoided. They brought new technologies, particularly ironworking, and new military tactics, including the use of iron weapons and advanced fortification systems. The Philistines would give this land its name, Palestine, a name that derives directly from Peliset, the Egyptian term for these Aegean invaders. They became Canaan's new neighbours, sometimes enemies, sometimes trading partners, but always distinct. A reminder that the Bronze Age collapse had fundamentally reordered the region's demographics. But modern archaeology has revealed something more complicated than simple invasion. Yes, the Sea Peoples existed. Yes, they attacked and destroyed cities. But they weren't the only factor, maybe not even the primary factor, because the collapse shows signs of being a perfect storm, a cascading systems failure where multiple crises hit simultaneously and reinforced each other until the entire Bronze Age world came apart. Climate change played a crucial role. Paleoclimatology, the study of ancient climates, shows that the eastern Mediterranean experienced a severe drought beginning around 1200 BCE and lasting for several decades. Not just a bad year or two, but a generational climate crisis. Tree ring data from ancient timbers shows dramatically reduced growth during this period. Pollen cores from lake sediments show shifts away from agricultural crops toward drought-resistant scrub vegetation. The Nile floods, which Egyptian texts had meticulously recorded for centuries, declined in height and reliability. This drought would have been catastrophic for Bronze Age civilization. These were agricultural societies dependent on relatively predictable rainfall and river flows. The entire system of taxation, trade, and administration assumed consistent food surpluses. When the rains failed year after year, the surpluses vanished. Famine spread. Populations that couldn't be fed locally could no longer rely on imports because everyone was experiencing the same crisis simultaneously. The documentary evidence supports this. One of the last letters sent from the king of Al-Ashir to the king of Ugarit found in those burned archives reads, "There is famine in your country. The enemy is making attacks on my land. My troops and chariots are stationed in the Hittite land, and all my ships are in the Luca lands. Thus the country is abandoned to itself. Let my father know it. The 7 ships of the enemy that came here inflicted much damage upon us." You can hear the desperation. Troops scattered, ships deployed elsewhere, the country defenseless. This isn't just military defeat. This is systemic collapse. Earthquakes made everything worse. The eastern Mediterranean sits on major tectonic boundaries. The archaeological record from this period shows evidence of massive seismic activity. At multiple sites, walls collapse in patterns consistent with earthquake damage rather than military assault. Buildings tilt and fall without burn layers. Some archaeologists have proposed an earthquake storm, a period of unusually frequent and severe seismic activity that destroyed fortifications and infrastructure just when cities needed them most to defend against raiders and maintain trade connections. And then there's the system's failure itself. Bronze Age civilization was incredibly interconnected. That was its strength, but also its fatal vulnerability. Cities depended on imported tin to make bronze. They depended on imported grain during bad harvest years. They depended on tribute from subject territories to support their administrative apparatus. They depended on trade goods to maintain the luxury that legitimized their rulers. When the system was working, this interdependence created prosperity. When it stopped working, the entire structure collapsed like a house of cards. Think of it like this. You're an Egyptian administrator in a garrison in Canaan. You're dependent on grain shipments from Egypt to feed your troops. But the Nile floods are failing, so Egypt needs all its grain domestically. Your garrison goes hungry. Local raiders, emboldened by your weakness, start attacking supply convoys. You can't patrol effectively because you've lost horses to disease and starvation. The local city that you're supposed to be protecting sees that you can't help them and stops paying tribute. Now you've got no resources at all. Your troops desert or turn to banditry themselves. The city falls to raiders or simply collapses from internal chaos. And suddenly a province is lost. Multiply that story across dozens of regions simultaneously and you get collapse. This is what's called a cascading failure. One crisis triggers another which triggers another until the system can't absorb any more shocks and everything breaks down at once. The drought destabilized agricultural production. Earthquakes destroyed defensive infrastructure. Sea peoples and other migrating groups, perhaps themselves driven by drought in their homelands, attacked weakened cities. Trade routes broke down. Administrative systems collapsed. And within a generation the entire Bronze Age world was gone. But here's what's remarkable. Some places survived. Some Canaanite cities, particularly in more defensible inland locations, made it through the collapse largely intact. Jerusalem, perched on its ridge in the highlands, seems to have survived. Megiddo was destroyed but quickly reoccupied. Hazor burned, but people returned to live in the ruins. The Phoenician coastal cities, Tyre and Sidon and Byblos, not only survived but would eventually thrive again, becoming the great maritime civilization of the Iron Age. And Canaanite culture, that complex weave of religious traditions, artistic styles, language, and social practices that had developed over 2,000 years, didn't disappear. It adapted. It transformed. It found new expressions in new circumstances. The survivors of the collapse scattered into smaller settlements, living in harder times, carried forward the knowledge and practices of their ancestors. They remembered the gods. They maintained the linguistic traditions. They preserved the agricultural knowledge and craft techniques. The Bronze Age collapse destroyed the cities and the palaces and the international networks that had sustained late Bronze Age civilization. But it didn't destroy the people or their culture. It just forced them to find new ways to survive in a world that had suddenly become much more dangerous and much less connected. From those survivors, living in the ruins of the Bronze Age world, new societies would eventually emerge. Societies that would carry forward elements of Canaanite culture even as they developed new identities and new ways of organizing themselves. The question is, who are those survivors and what would they become? Imagine hitting pause on the biblical story right before Joshua marches across the Jordan with trumpets and miracles and collapsing city walls. Freeze frame that. Now strip away everything that was written centuries later. No Joshua, no Moses, no 10 plagues, no parting seas. Just the land itself. Hills, valleys, small towns, terraced fields, shrines on hilltops, farmers herding goats and sheep. Now ask a blunt question. Where did the Israelites actually come from? If you only had the Bible, the answer would be simple. They were outsiders, escaped slaves from Egypt who invaded Canaan in a single generation, conquering city after city in a divinely sanctioned blitzkrieg. Clear, dramatic, cinematic. Archaeology tells a very different story. When we look in the dirt instead of the text, we don't see a foreign army sweeping in from the south. We don't see a sudden break between Canaanite and Israelite. What we see looks a lot more unsettling to traditional ideas. We see Canaanites slowly becoming something else. Around 1200 BCE, just as the Bronze Age collapse is ripping the old world order apart, something new starts appearing in the central highlands of Canaan, the hill country of what later texts will call Ephraim, Benjamin, Judah. Sparse, rocky lands that Egyptian officials mostly ignored, a kind of backwater, and in that backwater we find hundreds of new settlements, not cities, not fortresses, small villages, clusters of stone houses, terraces carved into the slopes to grow grain and olives, Cisterns dug into bedrock. Simple, practical, almost boring. But boring can be revolutionary. Before this period, those highlands are almost empty in the archaeological record. Then, within a couple of centuries, the population explodes, from maybe a few dozen tiny sites to over 300, tens of thousands of people, where before there'd been almost no one. So who are they? If the biblical conquest story were literally true, you'd expect to see burned Canaanite cities everywhere. You'd expect layers of ash and destruction dated to the exact time Joshua was supposedly conquering the land. You'd also expect foreign artifacts, Egyptian style, desert nomad style, anything that screams new people from somewhere else. We don't see that. Most Canaanite cities show no sign of sudden destruction in the period of Joshua. Jericho, a ruin mound with no big city walls to knock down. Ai, destroyed long before the supposed conquest and abandoned. Hazor does show a fiery end, but so do lots of cities during the chaos of the Bronze Age collapse. The pattern looks like general regional turmoil, not one unified military campaign. And those new highland villages, their pottery, their house styles, their tools, they're not foreign, they're Canaanite. Slightly simplified, slightly poorer, but clearly descended from the same local traditions that had been there for centuries. So archaeology points to a jarring conclusion. The earliest Israelites weren't an outside force conquering Canaan. They were Canaanites, already living in the land, reorganizing their lives in a chaotic age. We actually have the first historical mention of them from an enemy's point of view, an inscription carved into stone in Egypt around 1208 BCE, under Pharaoh Meneptah, son of Rameses Tekel. It's called the Meneptah Stele. Most of the stele is the usual royal propaganda. I beat these people, I crush those rebels, Egypt is awesome. Meneptah lists his victories in Canaan, places like Ashkelon, Giza, Yanoam, each city marked with the hieroglyphic sign for city-state. Then, in the middle of all that, a different kind of name. Israel is laid waste, his seed is no more. And this time the scribes don't use the city sign. They use the determinative for people, a group, not a location. To Egyptian bureaucrats, Israel isn't a city or a kingdom. It's a people living somewhere in Canaan's highlands. So by 1208 BCE, something called Israel already exists inside Canaan, not in Egypt, not across the Jordan, in the land itself. But what does Israel mean at this point? Is it a tribe? A loose coalition? A label for certain highland communities with a shared identity? The stele doesn't say. It just tells us three crucial things. Israel is real. Israel is in Canaan. And from Egypt's perspective, Israel is a people, not a foreign empire. To understand what that people looked like on the ground, we go back to those highland villages. Early Israelite sites share a few distinctive features. Houses are usually simple, four-room structures, rectangular buildings divided into multiple long rooms, often with a courtyard. They're reusable, modular, easy to expand as families grow. This house type becomes classic for later biblical Israel. We also see terrace farming on a big scale. Stone-built terraces stepping down, the slopes, capturing soil and water in a harsh environment. Add in rock-cut cisterns and storage pits, and you get a picture of families deeply committed to staying put in these hills. These aren't raiders camping between battles. They're subsistence farmers building permanent lives. Their pottery is unpretentious, mostly local, handmade or simply wheel-finished, following Canaanite shapes, but with fewer luxury imports. Their small shrines and cult objects, when we find them, look a lot like low-budget, simplified versions of Canaanite religious gear. Which raises the inevitable question, if their villages, tools, and architecture look Canaanite, were the Israelites just another kind of Canaanite? Genetics has started to weigh in. Ancient DNA from Canaanite burials at sites like Sidon and other Levantine cities shows a population that, over time, becomes the genetic backbone of later groups in the region. Modern populations across the Levant, Palestinians, Lebanese, many Jewish groups, carry a large portion of that same ancestral component. In other words, the people who lived in Canaan during the Bronze Age didn't vanish. They didn't get replaced wholesale by foreign invaders. They're still there, in the genes of people living in the region today. We don't yet have securely identified early Israelite burials with full genomes to compare directly, but everything we do know points in the same direction. Early Israelites were biologically indistinguishable from their Canaanite neighbours. Same mix of local Levantine ancestry, with some earlier input from Mesopotamia and Anatolia. Same deep roots in the land. So if they looked like Canaanites, built like Canaanites, and were related to Canaanites, what made them Israel? This is where identity markers come in. Small, everyday choices that say, we're not them. One of the weirdest and clearest is pigs. Across Canaan in the Bronze Age, people raise pigs. Not in huge numbers, but regularly enough that pig bones show up in garbage heaps. The animal leftovers archaeologists call faunal remains. Pigs are especially common in coastal and lowland sites. Then you look at the early highland settlements associated with Israel, and the pigs vanish. Almost no pig bones. Sheep, goats, cattle. Yes, pigs. Practically zero. This isn't a random accident. Over dozens and then hundreds of sites the pattern repeats. Highland communities, many of which will later be identified as Israelite territory, avoid pigs to a striking degree. Now, avoidance of pigs isn't uniquely Israelite. Some other groups in the ancient Near East also limited or frowned on pork. But in this specific region, at this specific time, the absence is loud. If you're a villager in the highlands and you don't eat pork, while the city folks in the valleys do, your diet is making a statement. It's an early identity boundary. Add in other clues, a tendency towards small local, shrines rather than big urban temples, hints of a preference for a particular central sanctuary site. Later traditions will make that Shiloh, then Jerusalem. Eventually, a strong emphasis on a single high god, Yahweh, above or instead of the broader Canaanite pantheon. At first, this Yahweh worship doesn't look purely monotheistic in the modern sense. Early Israelites probably still believed other gods existed. They just pledged primary loyalty to one. Over time, that loyalty hardens into exclusivity, Yahweh alone. So the identity recipe looks something like this. Take Canaanite villages uprooted by the collapse of the old city-state system, move them into marginal highlands where survival is hard. Strip away some luxuries and big temples. Add a strong loyalty to one main god. Draw a line in the sand with clear, we don't do X practices, like not eating pigs. Stir that for a couple hundred years, in a world full of enemies and empires, and you don't get an instant, clean new ethnicity. You get a gradually consolidating group that starts to call itself Israel. This is why most archaeologists today don't buy the biblical conquest model as literal history. The material record doesn't show a foreign invasion. It shows what scholars call gradual ethnogenesis, a slow, messy process of group formation from within an existing population. Instead of former slaves sweeping in from Egypt and exterminating Canaanites, we see local Canaanites adapting to crisis, forming new settlements, developing new social structures, and crucially, crafting a new story about who they are. Because identity isn't just genes and pots and pig bones, it's narrative. Centuries after these villages are founded, after small hill clans have grown into kingdoms called Israel and Judah, scribes begin writing, compiling, editing the stories that will become the Hebrew Bible. By then the political situation has changed dramatically. Empires like Assyria and Babylon loom over the region. The northern kingdom of Israel is destroyed. Elites from Judah are exiled. Under that pressure, telling a powerful story about the past becomes a survival strategy. And that's where the invention of tradition comes in. The phrase doesn't mean people are lying in some cynical way. It means communities under stress reach back into their memories and myths and reweave them into something coherent, something that explains who they are and why they matter. Later, Israelite and Jewish writers look at their world, two small kingdoms that had risen and fallen in the hills of an ancient Canaanite land, and they don't say, "We're Canaanites who reinvented ourselves." They say, "We were slaves in Egypt. Our God rescued us. He gave us this land. We're not just another local people. We're chosen, set apart, commanded to be different from the nations around us." Some of that story probably preserves real memories. Small groups who did come from Egypt, refugee bands that joined the highland communities, local revolts against Egyptian rule, threads of lived experience. But over time those threads are woven into a sweeping epic. One people, one exodus, one conquest, one covenant. A mythic past that turns a loose collection of Canaanite-descended villages into a nation with a destiny. Archaeology and genetics pull the curtain back a little. They show us that under the epic, the Israelites are children of the same land as the Canaanites. Same soil, same hills, same genetic roots. The difference is how they chose to tell their story. They took local gods and elevated one to supremacy. They took ordinary food rules and turned them into markers of holiness. They took the hard-won experience of surviving in a collapsed world and turned it into a theology of deliverance and law. And then they wrote that down with such force that 3,000 years later, billions of people still know their name. So when we ask, were the Israelites Canaanites? The answer is both yes and no. Yes, in the sense of ancestry, language, material culture. They grew out of Canaanite soil. No, in the sense of identity. They deliberately defined themselves as something new, something set apart, often in direct opposition to the very world that created them. The Israelite question isn't just about who moved where or who fought whom. It's about how a group of highland farmers, descended from a forgotten Bronze Age civilization, reinvented themselves so powerfully that they reshaped the religious imagination of half the planet. And their story doesn't end with them. Because just as Israel emerged from Canaan, another offshoot was forming on the coast, one that would take Canaanite culture in a very different direction. To see what happened when Canaanites turned to the sea instead of the hills, we have to follow the merchants, sailors, and city-states of the northern coast. We have to meet the Phoenicians. The story could have ended with fire, cities burned, palaces smashed, temples toppled. The Bronze Age collapse looked for a moment like it had erased Canaan from history, but it didn't. Because here's the twist. Some of the new people who rise out of that rubble, the mysterious Phoenicians, aren't new at all. They're Canaanites, just with better ships. If you could stand on a hill above the shattered landscape of 11th century BCE Canaan and fast forward a couple generations, you'd see something unexpected. The interior is fractured. Small kingdoms, hill villages, tribal groups plotting and fighting. But along the coast, a different story. There, cities not only survive, they thrive. Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, names that will echo for 1,000 years in Egyptian, Greek and Roman texts. Names that, in older inscriptions, are simply called by another word, Canaan. Ancient writers knew this. The people we call Phoenicians called themselves the people of Canaan. An Assyrian king boasts of conquering the land of Amaru and Canaan. Greek authors, writing centuries later, talk about Phoenicians from the land of Canaan. Even the Bible remembers them this way, referring to the Sidonians as Canaanites. So what changed? not their identity, their strategy. Instead of trying to control land, they learn to control the sea. Picture the coastline of the Eastern Mediterranean after the collapse. Instead of a unified imperial system, you have a patchwork. Egypt is weak, the Hittites are gone, the Mycenaean palaces in Greece are dust. Trade routes that once funneled wealth through great kingdoms now hang loose like severed cables. The Canaanite cities on the coast grab those cables and start weaving them together. Tyre, perched on a rocky island just off the coast, becomes nearly unassailable, a natural fortress turned into a maritime powerhouse. Sidon, a little to the north, builds fleets and workshops, sending ships east, west, and south, following every coastline they can find. Byblos, already ancient even by Bronze Age standards, doubles down on its old specialty, timber trade. For 1,000 years, Egyptians had come here for cedarwood to build ships and temples. Now, with the old system gone, Byblos doesn't fade. It adapts. It becomes a key link in a new Canaanite-run network. From the deck of a Phoenician ship, the world looks very different. You're no longer thinking in kingdoms and borders. You're thinking in harbours and headlands, wind patterns and currents, months-long journeys stitched together by memory and rumour. And that shift, from land to sea, from empire to network, turns a battered corner of Canaan into the Silicon Valley of the Iron Age. Their secret weapon wasn't just ships, it was information. For centuries, Canaanite scribes had used cuneiform, the wedge-shaped writing system inherited from Mesopotamia. Powerful, flexible, and ridiculously complicated. Hundreds of signs, years of training. Writing was a specialist game. Somewhere in late Bronze Age Canaan, scribes started cheating. They noticed something obvious but revolutionary. You don't need a symbol for every word or every idea or every syllable. You just need a symbol for each sound. Take the sound B, draw a little picture of a bet, a house, and let that picture stand not for house, but for the sound B. Do the same for a gimel, a camel, dalet, a door, and so on, until you've got a whole set of signs for sounds. Consonants lined up like a code. You've just invented an alphabet. We first see this in what scholars call Proto-Canaanite, or early alphabetic inscriptions, scratched on pottery and rock in the highlands and along the coast. Not many, not fancy, but enough to prove the idea was there long before the Greeks ever dreamed of letters. The Phoenicians take that idea and weaponize it. They standardize the script, trim it to 22 characters, and start using it everywhere. Shipping labels, contracts, temple dedications, trade deals. Suddenly, writing isn't a priestly superpower anymore. It's a merchant's tool. If you can teach a teenager to carve 22 signs, you can teach them to track cargo, sign agreements, copy letters. Literacy spreads, not universally, not democratically, but far wider than before. On a Phoenician quay, a rough dock worker might not be fully literate, but he can probably recognize the mark for his city, his employer, his shipment. Now follow the ships, north and west to Cyprus, onwards to the Greek Aegean, across to Sicily, Sardinia, Spain. Everywhere the Phoenicians go, their script follows, carved on pottery, metal, stone. Greek traders see these signs and copy them, but with a twist. The Phoenician script only wrote consonants. Vowels were assumed. Greek, with its different structure, needed vowels on paper. So they borrow some Phoenician letters they don't need for consonants, aleph, he, yod, ayin, and repurpose them as A, E, I, O. From there, the chain is straightforward. Canaanite, Phoenician, Greek, Latin, English. Every time you write your name, every time you type a username, every time you read a street sign, you're handling the fossilized bones of a Canaanite invention. You don't speak their language, you don't worship their gods, but you write with their ghosts. Of course, script isn't the only thing flowing out of those ports. Imagine opening a crate in some dusty palace warehouse in Assyria or Greece. Inside, tight bundles of deep purple cloth, the colour so dark it's almost black, shimmering with a reddish sheen when the light hits it. This is Tyrian purple, the most coveted dye in the ancient world. It comes from a tiny sea snail, Murex brandaris, that lives among the rocks along the Levantine coast. One snail produces a single drop of milky fluid. Expose it to sunlight, watch it oxidize. It turns green, then blue, then finally, after a long process and a horrifying smell, that rich, royal purple. It takes thousands of snails to dye a single cloak. No wonder purple becomes the colour of kings. The Phoenicians master this process. They guard it fiercely. They build entire economies around it. The name Phoenician itself may come from the Greek phoenixtus purple red. To the Greeks, these people are literally the purple dye folks. Alongside the dye comes another treasure, cedar wood. Canaanite cedar forests, especially in the Lebanon mountains, produce massive, straight, resin-rich trunks, perfect for shipbuilding, perfect for monumental architecture, resistant to rot, fragrant, beautiful. For centuries, Egypt had come to Byblos for cedar. Now ships from everywhere do the same. A timber contract carved on a tablet in a coastal temple might simultaneously pay a local ruler, a logging, crew in the mountains, and a ship captain bound for Cyprus. You can trace Phoenician influence in the objects that move with them. Intricate metalwork, glass beads and vessels, carved ivory, elaborate jewellery. But beneath all the luxury, the real commodity is connectivity. They are building a web of trade routes that wraps the Mediterranean in purple-stained strings. At the far western edge of that web, something extraordinary happens. Sometime in the 9th century BCE, colonists from Tyre sail past Sicily, skirt Sardinia, and cross to the coast of North Africa. There, on a sheltered bay in what is now Tunisia, they found a new city, Khat Hadasht. The new city. We know it as Carthage. If the old Canaan was a patchwork of little kingdoms squeezed between empires, Carthage is the opposite, a daughter of a small coastal city that grows into an empire of its own. Carthage starts like any other Phoenician colony, a trading station, a safe harbour, a node on the network, but over centuries it swells, it commands fertile hinterlands, it builds one of the largest navies in the ancient Mediterranean, it develops its own council, its own generals, its own ambitions. The language Carthaginians speak, a form of Canaanite, the gods they worship, variants of Baal, Melkart, Tanit, gods whose roots go back to Bronze Age Canaan, the script they use to write contracts, treaties, curses, the same Phoenician letters that can trace their ancestry back to Highland Canaanite graffito, and eventually this western Canaanite city, Carthage, will grow strong enough to challenge a rising power from Italy, Rome. The Punic Wars, Rome versus Carthage, are, in one sense, the final act of the Canaanite story. A people who began as farmers and city dwellers in the Levant, colonized by Egyptians and harassed by empires, end up commanding fleets that nearly strangle the young Roman Republic. They lose, in the end. Rome raises Carthage. But the fact that they got that far at all tells you just how far the Canaanite transformation had gone, from vassals to rivals. Back in the east, the old Canaanite heartland is still there, and it hasn't vanished from the stories we know best. The Bible remembers a king named Hiram of Tyre, a Phoenician ruler whose city straddles the line between Old Canaan and new maritime power. Hiram supplies wood, craftsmen and gold to a king in the highlands, Solomon of Israel. Strip away the legend for a moment and look at the pattern. You have an inland kingdom with political ambitions and religious projects, palaces, a temple, a desire to impress. It doesn't have enough good timber. It doesn't have top-tier artisans in certain specialties. it does have access to agricultural products and maybe silver or other tradable wealth. On the coast, you have a Canaanite city that has been doing international trade for centuries. Its merchants know where the cedar grows, how to cut it, how to ship it. Its artisans can carve ivory, work bronze, design complex wood structures. So the Highland King cuts a deal with the coastal king. In return for food and political alliance, Hiram's people bring cedars from Lebanon, rafts of timber floated down the coast, skilled workers to build and decorate the temple in Jerusalem. The partnership between Solomon and Hiram, whatever its exact historical details, is a snapshot of Canaan's final form. The old agricultural and pastoral highlands tying themselves to the maritime networks of their coastal cousins. Israel is not dealing with some exotic foreign power, it's dealing with the last, richest face of Canaan. What makes this all the more remarkable is how long Canaanite culture survives. Languages come and go, empires rise and fall, Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, they all sweep through the Levant in turn. But Canaanite in various dialects hangs on stubbornly. By the time of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, Phoenician inscriptions are still being carved across the Mediterranean. In Carthage, Punic, a descendant of Canaanite, is spoken and written well into the Roman period. Latin writers in the 1st century CE complain that local peasants in North Africa are still speaking Punic. Canaanite religion lingers too, even as it changes. The gods get new names, new combinations. Baal of this city, Melkart of that one, Astarte, Tanit. In Greek and Roman texts, they're equated with Zeus, Heracles, Aphrodite. But beneath the translation, old patterns survive: storm gods, sea gods, fertility goddesses, protective city deities. Temple rituals continue on coastal heights and island harbours long after the inland Canaanite cults mentioned in the Bible have faded. Even when Roman emperors dedicate temples in Byblos or Berytus, they sometimes choose sites that had been sacred since the Bronze Age. Customs persist as well. Burial practices, food taboos, naming traditions, local festivals, all the small, unrecorded pieces of culture that don't make it into elite histories, but cling stubbornly to daily life. If you followed a single Canaanite family line from Bronze Age Megiddo to Iron Age Tyre, to Punic Carthage to some rural village under Roman rule, you'd see layer after layer of change, new overlords, new scripts, new fashions. But under it all, you'd also see threads of continuity. Similar names, similar gods hiding under foreign aliases, similar words whispered at graves or over newborns. That's the real Canaanite legacy. Not just a list of firsts to put on a slide, alphabet, purple dye, cedar ships, but a demonstration of cultural resilience. A people who get conquered, absorbed, renamed, scattered, and yet manage to smuggle their ideas into everyone else's future, into the letters on your screen, into the stories of the Bible, into the wars that shaped Rome, into place names, loan words, and half-remembered gods that echo faintly in later traditions. Canaan doesn't disappear. It mutates. It becomes Phoenicia, becomes Punic, becomes part of the genetic and cultural code of the Mediterranean world. And even when their language finally falls silent, their inventions keep talking for them. Every time you write a word, sign your name, or read a history about a land that, before it was holy, was simply Canaan. For most of Western history, the Canaanites were ghosts made of other people's words. They were the villains in someone else's scriptures, the idol worshippers the prophets railed against, the people God supposedly ordered wiped off the map. We had their enemies' stories, their conquerors' inscriptions, the propaganda carved into temple walls and copied into sacred scrolls. But we didn't have their voice. For centuries, historians tried to reconstruct Canaan from this second-hand evidence. A line in the Bible here, a passing insult in an Egyptian text there, a few scattered ruins on Levantine hillsides. It was like trying to understand a person by only reading their hate mail. Then, in 1929, a Syrian farmer's plough hit a stone. He was working his field near a little village called Ras Shamra, on the Mediterranean coast of what is now Syria. When he moved the rock, he uncovered a cut stone slab, a tomb. The local authorities came, then French archaeologists. They started digging. What they found changed the story of Canaan forever. Beneath the farmer's field lay the ruins of an ancient port city, Ugarit. Not a village, not a lonely temple, but a major Canaanite city-state frozen in time, buried under the ashen rubble of a Bronze Age catastrophe. Streets, houses, palaces, temples, storage jars still where they were left when the city burned. And inside one of the buildings, something even more precious than gold or ivory. Clay tablets, hundreds of them, then thousands. They were covered in tiny wedge-shaped signs, cuneiform, but not in Sumerian, not in Akkadian, not in any known language. This was something else, something local, something Canaanite. For the first time in history, we were staring at Canaanite words written by Canaanites, not filtered through Egyptian scribes or Israelite authors, their own archives, their own literature, their own myths. It took a few years to crack the code. The language turned out to be Ugaritic, a close cousin to ancient Hebrew and Phoenician, written with its own alphabetic cuneiform script. Once scholars figured it out, the tablets started talking, and what they said blew a hole straight through our old picture of the Canaanites. We suddenly had entire mythological cycles, the exploits of Baal, the storm god, El, the high father of the gods, Anat, the terrifying warrior goddess, Mot, the god of death. We could read their poetry line by line, their ritual instructions, their temple inventories, their letters between kings. Instead of vague pagan neighbours in the Bible, the Canaanites emerged as a fully realised culture with a rich, complex religious system. The Baal cycle describes a divine drama. Baal fighting the sea god Yam, building his palace, facing off with Mot in the underworld, dying and returning in a cycle tied to fertility, rain, and agricultural renewal. The language is vivid, full of parallelism and imagery, so close to Hebrew poetry that biblical psalms suddenly looked less unique and more like part of a broader Canaanite tradition. We learned that El isn't just a generic word for God in Semitic languages. El was a specific deity, a patriarchal, wise creator figure, head of the divine council, surrounded by a court of lesser gods. Sound familiar? It should. The Hebrew Bible is full of references to a divine council, sons of God, and a high god named El before Yahweh's cult becomes fully exclusive. Ugarit pulled the curtain back. It showed that early Israelite religion didn't appear out of nowhere. It grew up inside a Canaanite religious world, borrowing, transforming, and eventually rejecting elements of a much older mythological system. But Ugarit didn't just revolutionize our picture of Canaanite religion. The archives also contained administrative texts, legal documents, diplomatic correspondence with Egypt and the Hittites, records of merchants, treaties, marriage contracts. Suddenly, Canaanite city-state wasn't just an abstract phrase. You could see how a Canaanite bureaucracy worked, how they taxed grain, how they managed temple estates, how scribes learned to write. You could even see everyday life in small details, lists of household goods, wine deliveries, rations for workers, payments to artisans. A living city, mid-sentence, cut off by the Bronze Age collapse and preserved for 3,000 years. This was the first big crack in the old biblical caricature. The second crack came not from the ground, but from inside the bones of the people who once lived there. Fast forward to 2017. A team of geneticists publishes a study that makes headlines around the world. They've managed to sequence DNA from Bronze Age skeletons buried in what is now Lebanon, in the ancient Canaanite city of Sidon. Then they compare that ancient DNA to modern populations in the region. Today, when people think about the Holy Land, they think about the Bible. Abraham and Isaac, Moses and the Exodus, David and Solomon. These are the stories that shaped Western civilization, the narratives we've heard 1,000 times. But here's what almost nobody knows. Before any of these biblical figures walked the earth, before the first word of Scripture was ever written, there was another civilization living in this land. A sophisticated, powerful, culturally rich society that built cities, traded across continents, and worshipped gods whose names would later become synonyms for evil. They were called the Canaanites. And the Bible wanted you to forget they ever existed, not just forget them. The Hebrew scriptures portrayed them as the ultimate villains, practitioners of child sacrifice and sexual depravity, enemies to be conquered and utterly destroyed. God himself, according to the book of Joshua, commanded their complete annihilation. For thousands of years, that's how history remembered them, if it remembered them at all. The Canaanites became a cautionary tale, a civilization so wicked that divine genocide was justified. Except here's the problem with that story. It's not true, not even close. In the past few decades, archaeologists have been digging up something extraordinary in Israel, Lebanon, Syria and Jordan. Not just pottery shards and broken walls, but evidence of a civilization that was astonishingly advanced. They invented the alphabet that you're reading right now. They built sprawling trade networks that connected 3 continents. They created art, literature, and religious texts that influenced everyone from the ancient Greeks to the early Israelites themselves. And perhaps most shocking of all, genetic studies published in just the last few years have proven something remarkable. The Canaanites weren't destroyed. They're still here. Their DNA flows through the veins of millions of people living in Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and yes, even Israel today. So what actually happened? Who are these people that the Bible worked so hard to erase? Why were they demonized? And what can their story tell us about the real history of the Holy Land before Scripture turned it into something else entirely? If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's completely fine. That's genuinely why I make these. But maybe hit subscribe first and tell me where you are and what time it is right now. I love checking comments and seeing Tokyo at sunrise, London at lunch, Los Angeles at midnight, all watching the same story unfold. Here's what makes the Canaanite story so incredible. We're not talking about some minor tribe that vanished into obscurity. We're talking about a civilization that dominated the Eastern Mediterranean for thousands of years. When the pyramids of Egypt were already ancient, the Canaanites were building fortified cities. When Babylon was rising to power in Mesopotamia, Canaanite merchants were sailing across the Mediterranean, establishing colonies that would become legendary. The Phoenicians, those master sailors who everybody's heard of, they were Canaanites. Same people, same culture, just a different chapter of the story. But somehow this entire civilization got compressed into a few ugly chapters of the Old Testament, reduced to obstacles in someone else's story, enemies to be cleared away so the real narrative could begin. It's like trying to understand the history of North America by only reading about the Wild West and ignoring the thousands of years of indigenous civilization that came before. You'd miss everything that actually matters. What we're about to uncover changes everything. From the very first farmers who settled in Jericho 10,000 years ago, making it one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities on earth, to the Bronze Age kingdoms that traded with pharaohs and built temples that rivaled anything in the ancient world. From the gods and goddesses whose myths would echo through Greek and Roman religion, to the mysterious sea peoples whose invasion triggered a catastrophic collapse. From the real origins of the Israelites, which archaeology has revealed are far more complicated than Exodus suggests, to the genetic detective work that's rewriting the story right now. This isn't just ancient history. This is the foundation beneath the foundation. The civilization that was here first. The people whose cities became Jerusalem and Sidon and Tyre, whose language evolved into Hebrew, whose gods became demons, whose descendants never actually left. So let's go back. Way back. Before Abraham heard the call, before Moses saw the burning bush, before David faced Goliath, let's go back 10,000 years and discover who was really living in the land that would become the crossroads of civilization. The land that everyone would fight over. The land that 3 religions would call holy. Because before any of that, before the Bible began its story, there was Canaan. Forget everything you think you know about the beginning of civilization. Forget Mesopotamia. Forget Egypt. The real story starts in a narrow strip of land between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River, where something happened 12,000 years ago that would change human history forever. The last ice age was ending. For 100,000 years, glaciers had covered much of the northern hemisphere, locking up so much water that sea levels were 400 feet lower than today. You could walk from Europe to Britain, from Siberia to Alaska. The world was a very different place. But around 12,000 BCE, the climate shifted. Temperature rose, rainfall patterns changed, and in one specific region, something extraordinary happened. The eastern Mediterranean coast, the land that would eventually be called Canaan, transformed into what anthropologists now call the Fertile Crescent's western anchor. Grasslands that had been sparse and seasonal suddenly became lush and reliable. Wild cereals, barley and wheat spread across hillsides in dense harvestable stands. Gazelles, wild cattle, and other game animals multiplied in numbers that seem almost impossible today. And the humans living there noticed. These people, the culture we now call the Natufians, were hunter-gatherers. But they weren't like the mobile bands that had dominated human society for hundreds of thousands of years. They were doing something unprecedented. They were staying put. The archaeological evidence is unmistakable. Starting around 12,500 BCE, Natufian communities began building permanent villages. Not seasonal camps that got abandoned when resources moved. Actual villages with stone foundations, storage facilities, and evidence of year-round occupation. They were building homes designed to last generations, not seasons. The most remarkable site is Ain Malahar in northern Israel. Over 50 circular stone structures, some with plastered floors, arranged in clusters that suggest family units. Storage pits dug into bedrock, grinding stones so heavy they could never be transported. This wasn't a temporary camp, this was home. But here's what's truly wild. They were doing all this before agriculture existed. The Natufians weren't farming. They were harvesting wild grain so abundant that it made sense to stay in one place. They developed sickles with flint blades, tools specifically designed for cutting grain stalks. The blades show a distinctive polish, what archaeologists call sickle sheen, created by cutting silica-rich grain stems over and over. They built granaries to store their harvests. They developed elaborate grinding stones to process the grain into flour. They had essentially created all the infrastructure of agricultural civilization without actually domesticating a single plant. They were living on nature's abundance, but in a way that required permanent settlement, specialized tools, and complex planning. It was an evolutionary stepping stone, a halfway point between mobile hunting and farming that nobody had predicted could exist. And it worked. For over 3,000 years, Natufian sites show evidence of populations far larger than typical hunter-gatherer bands. Some villages might have housed 200, 300 people living together year-round. They developed art, carving animal figures and human forms from stone and bone. They created personal ornaments from shells traded from the Mediterranean coast. They buried their dead with elaborate grave goods, suggesting concepts of status and perhaps even early forms of inherited wealth. Most remarkably, they domesticated the dog. Not wolves following human camps hoping for scraps, but actual domestic dogs, bred for specific traits, living alongside humans in permanent settlements. The earliest undisputed domestic dog remains come from a Natufian site, a puppy buried carefully beside a human, their hand positioned as if resting on the dog's shoulder. Even 12,000 years later, that gesture of affection is unmistakable. But then, around 10,800 BCE, disaster struck. The climate changed again, suddenly, catastrophically. A period called the Younger Dryas plunged the region back into near Ice Age conditions for over 1,000 years. The wild grain fields that had supported permanent villages began failing. Rainfall became unreliable. The easy abundance disappeared. The Natufians faced a choice. They could go back to mobile hunting and gathering, abandoning their villages and their settled lifestyle, or they could try something desperate. They could attempt to control their food supply directly. They chose the second option, and in doing so they invented agriculture. The transition wasn't smooth or intentional. It was a messy, desperate response to environmental crisis. But by 9,500 BCE, communities across the region were deliberately planting and harvesting domesticated grains. They were selecting seeds from the most productive plants, saving them through winter, and planting them in prepared fields the following spring. The Neolithic Revolution, the transformation from hunting and gathering to farming, wasn't a discovery. It was an act of desperation by a people who refused to give up their settled lifestyle when nature stopped providing. And it happened first, or at least very early right here in Canaan. By 9000 BCE, farming villages dotted the landscape from the Mediterranean coast to the Jordan Valley. Permanent settlements built from mud brick, harvesting domesticated wheat and barley, herding early domestic goats and sheep. These weren't just villages anymore. They were becoming something else entirely. Enter Jericho. Walk into any archaeology department and mention Jericho, and you'll see professors' eyes light up. Because Jericho isn't just ancient. It's absurdly ancient. Impossibly ancient. So ancient that it makes other ancient cities look like modern suburbs. The first settlement at Jericho dates to around 9,600 BCE. That's 11,600 years ago. For context, that's 6,000 years before the Egyptian pyramids, 7,000 years before Stonehenge, 8,500 years before the first writing appears in Mesopotamia. And it wasn't a village. By 8,000 BCE, Jericho had become something that wouldn't be matched anywhere else in the world for thousands of years. It had a stone wall, a massive stone wall over 11 feet tall and 5 feet thick running around the entire settlement. Inside the wall was a stone tower, 28 feet tall, with an internal staircase of 22 steps. Read that again. 10,000 years ago, people in Jericho were building monumental architecture in stone. Nobody knows why. The wall doesn't seem designed for defense, at least not against human enemies. It's too small to protect against a determined army. Some archaeologists think it was a flood barrier protecting the settlement from seasonal flooding. Others suggest it was ceremonial, a massive public works project designed to demonstrate communal power and solidarity. But here's the truly bizarre part. The people living in Jericho were engaged in what can only be described as a skull cult. They were burying their dead beneath the floors of their houses, normal enough for Neolithic societies, but then weeks or months later they would dig up the skulls. Just the skulls. They would remove the jawbone, fill the skull with mud or plaster, and carefully model facial features over the bone. Eyes made from shells, painted facial features, individual portrait-like reconstructions. These plastered skulls were then kept in the houses, probably displayed prominently. We found dozens of them, each one individually modelled, each one unique. They weren't religious idols or generic representations of ancestors. They were portraits, specific individuals preserved and remembered. What does this mean? Nobody knows for certain. Maybe they were honouring important ancestors. Maybe they believed the dead needed to remain part of the household. Maybe it was early ancestor worship, the preserved faces of family patriarchs or matriarchs watching over their descendants. What we do know is that it shows sophisticated symbolic thinking, complex ritual behaviour, and a concept of individual identity that persisted beyond death. These weren't simple farmers scratching out a living. They were building a culture, creating meaning, grappling with mortality and memory in ways that still feel eerily human today. By 7000 BCE, Jericho was part of a broader transformation sweeping across Canaan and the wider Fertile Crescent. The Neolithic was in